Okay, so I am going to go through my slides so incredibly rapidly, but that's because you know the story already. So the story is we know that renewables are increasing incredibly rapidly, as is electrification. And that's bringing its own challenges. So this is a meta-study looking at 600 studies done across the electricity sector worldwide, and it looks at what happens as you increase the penetration of renewables on the system. And we know this because we've seen it as we operate our systems, but basically the costs increase. And the key point at which it kicks up is when you hit more than 55% terawatt hours being produced from renewables, from intermittent renewables. Now, there is a lot of forecasts out there, so these numbers aren't that accurate, but the key point is Europe will reach that point in about 4 years, possibly earlier. And that means we're about to hit a really high-cost energy system. And we also all know what flexibility is. We've always had it. Historically, it's been in our gas CCGTs. We need a lot more of it because of load growth from transport and heating. But we also need it from consumers' devices. To avoid this high-cost system, we can build flexible generation, but we can also harness flexible load. We can increase storage, and this is something that you're seeing sort of across the board. But we also need to do the reinforcement of networks. One of the challenges right now is that the rate at which we need to reinforce is being outpaced by our ability to do so. In the UK, we need an 8-fold increase in the amount of investment in transmission in the next 5 years when compared to the previous. So even if we could build out all the network we needed, we have problems. And flexibility brings huge value. So the purple block, and we know that. So there's a study that was done by BVN looking across Europe. By 2030, consumers in Europe can save 71 billion euros annually. Similar picture in the UK, a sort of a 10 billion system saving. And where are those savings coming from? Lower OPEX and curtailment costs. So that's the blue color at the top. But the biggest driver is this lower build-out of renewables. You don't need a system with as much renewables if you have flexibility. And how much flexibility do we need? I was at a InnoGrid conference last year, and someone asked this question, and no one had an answer. Well, actually, we've got lots of answers, and it depends who does the modeling. But to give you a rule of thumb, because, you know, I'm an engineer and you need something which is about 10 and you call it 100, rule of thumb, we need about 1/3 of the amount of generation there in flexibility. So looking at the UK, we need around 133 gigawatts of flexibility. By 2030, so earlier in time, we need 3 gigawatts of EV flex, we need 18 gigawatts of storage, and we need a bit of flex from our washing machines as well. And the challenge is, as you've probably noticed, we've got a problem in 4 years' time, probably earlier. We can save consumers a lot of money. We can't build fast. But when you look at the time it takes to use flexibility operationally in a system, if I take the UK as an example, it's taken us sort of around 10 years from those first flexibility pilots to moving towards standardized procurement, standardized platforms. I'm sorry, we don't have 10 years anymore. So this next session is a session where you guys have to do the work, which is a great relief to me. What we're going to do is ask you a question about how advanced is Europe in terms of using flexibility to manage the system. So just going back to this slide before, are we at flex pilots? Are we at sort of standardizing it, but at an individual DSO level or an individual TSO level? Are we beginning to have business as usual across the board, but not quite joined up? Or are we here with standardized national, international, cross-European platforms? So the answer is either 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I'm looking at my colleagues, some of whom are giving me funny faces. What happens now? It's not loading? Okay, I'm just going to do show of hands. This is like the demand flexibility service low-tech approach. So are we at 1? So before I ask, I want you to think of a number in your head. Where is Europe in terms of operationalizing flexibility? And if you think we're at 1, please raise your hand now. So go back to here. 1 is here. We're doing some flex pilots. 2 is we're doing flex pilots across the board. You know, most organizations have tried flex pilots. 3 is we've now got business as usual operations in over half the organizations. And 4 is we're using it across the board. So, are we at 1? Oh, okay. So that's worse than I thought. How many for 2? Okay. Now, what are the optimistic souls that think we're at 3? Is there anyone? Yay! And then, is there anyone who's... Okay. So, we're at sort of... We're somewhere here, right? That sort of says we're 8 years away. So, we can't be 8 years away. If you can build 5 liquefied natural gas platforms up in Germany within a year, we can do this, and we have to do this. So the next session, over to you. What I'd like you to do, we're going to break into 4 groups. You all have a little sticker. There are 4 moderators here. So if the moderators could come to the front. So I am green, and I will take all the green people over to the children's play area.
I am yellow, and we're also going over this way, so follow me if you are yellow.
And red, we're going over to the whiteboard by the kitchen.
And blue, we're going to the whiteboard.
And your job is to... What are the key barriers? And be as specific as you can. And then what do we need to do? Because at the end of the workshop tomorrow, we're going to look at where we need to get to, and we're going to be very clear what the next steps are and how we, as an industry, are going to get there. Easy. And we're coming back at 4. who is appropriately dressed. And I'd like to point out that none of my colleagues are.
Thank you. I have the honor now to present our findings, and it's quite easy to be first because there will be a lot of overlap, I guess. One remark in advance, not everyone in our group shares every point here. That's quite important to say, but just go through it. First section is the regulatory part. In Germany especially, we have a lack of digital mindset and vision on concerning companies and ministries, but we need some change there in the regulatory framework. So we also see somehow a lack of political willingness to make these kind of decisions that need to be made in order to make it happen, to give us a frame which gives us the regulatory framework for flexibility. Next one is the topic of market design. We already addressed this today in a lot of topics. We have some ideas on non-zonal prices or price signals that are missing, non-dynamic network prices and so on. We touched about it already this morning. Third section is the economic part. I think in Germany one very important point on high level is that flexibility at the moment still does not have a business case, a positive business case. So that's the main barrier. You need to invest too much money in order to make it happen. And the last point is the technical part. It was also a bit touched this morning. We need a huge data ecosystem. We need standardized procedures and processes to scale it up. We need descriptions of APIs and so on. So that's the other section, the number 4. If anyone of the group Green wants to add something, please feel free. Okay, thumbs up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, we had a really interesting conversation, and I'll just talk about kind of the top themes that came up and which countries they were focused on. So one of the key themes that came up was a lack of consumer education. So that's particularly prevalent in Spain, where customers aren't really aware of what their flexibility can do. And another big one was a lack of market incentives, so not enough of a viable business case available for customers. So this was particularly in Italy and also in Belgium, that was mentioned. And another big theme was data openness, so lack of data openness and cybersecurity concerns. So this is a big problem in Germany and also the Netherlands. And linking to Germany, the lack of infrastructure and smart meter rollout is obviously causing barriers to flexibility as well. And then an interesting one that I thought was in Australia. They've got a very fragmented market, and this has caused like a bit of political constraints where there's not enough standardization across the markets. So yeah, those are the key themes. Does anyone from my group want to raise anything else that I've missed? Hopefully I've got everything. Great.
Thanks. So we also had a really interesting discussion, and I think in our group there was quite a big German presence, which you may see in some of the themes and the points that we had. But one of the similar themes actually to the other groups, one of the big ones were technical barriers, and particularly a lack of smart metering, which I think we've already heard today is a particular issue in Germany. And that really holds back what suppliers can offer and limits the type of tariffs that they're able to provide to consumers. We also had a discussion around monitoring, particularly quite poor visibility on low voltage networks, and that's a problem for how network operators forecast. We had another a theme that was around kind of regulatory issues, so poor regulatory framework and kind of no incentives for end consumers. Equally, I think we recognise that there's a bit of an education piece needed for the regulators. So sometimes the regulators don't necessarily realise that they're part of the solution, so they need to be kind of brought along on the journey. Then we moved on to speaking about kind of commercial and economic barriers. I think particularly had one example that said, often relying on the consumer option is kind of more expensive from a point of kind of economics. So economics often favour incumbents, and rather than kind of the best solution from a kind of carbon perspective. Similar themes in terms of kind of social behaviour. So consumers in some situations kind of want fixed prices. So there's a big piece there around kind of education of what consumers can provide and kind of new business models and what flexibility they can provide to the system. And then finally on market design, quite a stark point, but essentially in some countries there is no market. And kind of awareness is quite poor for OEMs in particular, who kind of need to improve awareness for other market players that are kind of less sophisticated than suppliers. Did I cover everything, roughly? Great.
Thanks. So I think most of what we discussed was covered, but I think there were a few interesting points that we had that weren't covered, actually. So one was potentially a kind of what we are doing well now in GB that could be shared elsewhere, which is the move from a CapEx DSO mechanism to a TOTEX. So this is where you can actually get paid, or you can receive returns as a DSO for reducing your operational budget, and so that really opens you up to getting benefits from Flex. So that was interesting. We also talked about the kind of coordination between different market makers, so DSOs, TSOs, government, regulator, and quite a kind of piecemeal approach that we've often seen across Europe. And actually, to that point, that there needs to be kind of coordination country to country as well, so that we really can apply the same learnings everywhere. We had an interesting discussion around kind of prices and their complexity. So I think the panel earlier really dived into the need for prices, right? But we took this a little bit step further and tried to work out how you would kind of make sure that you could get from the genuine kind of needs of the network into simple prices that were kind of reflective of those physical costs. And I think that's still an open question, but that's definitely a problem we could identify. And yeah, finally, I think basically we've already covered around a kind of data visibility and improving technical capabilities that would give DSOs in particular confidence that Flex, and particularly domestic Flex, can solve the problems that they face. Yeah. Cool. Anyone from my group have anything to add? No. Okay, excellent. I think we can move on to the next session.
Okay, so I'm going to rely on your stamina at this point. So this is the last session. It's focusing on where the grids need Flex. And I'd like to introduce to you Soteris from UK Power Network. Oh, sorry, no, I'm not going to do that just yet. You can relax. I'd like to introduce Maddie Brooks, who's our lead on regulatory and I've gone blank. Regulatory markets in the UK, just to give a bit of framework for some of the options and the ways of thinking about pricing and networks, and trying to create where the grids, trying to help define where grids need Flex. So, Maddie, over to you.
Thanks, Marcia. Great. Yeah, so for those that haven't already met me, I am Maddie, and yeah, I'm here really to set the scene for the final session of day that Hull does between dinner, so don't worry, it is soon approaching. So yeah, we've gone into this in a fair bit already, but I guess kind of DSOs have two core options really for how to deal with constraints on their network. The first option is probably more familiar to us all. The more traditional option is to reinforce networks and kind of increase the capacity of networks in line with increases in demand from consumers. The second option, which is why we're all here today, is around use of flexibility. So that flexibility can come from kind of generation assets and storage, but also from consumers. So that's about managing load more smartly and making more efficient use of network capacity that already exists. I think it's really important with the second option to point out that this is really about, it's not an alternative to option number one, but it's really about deferring the need for reinforcement. And I think that's particularly important now where demand is increasing in pretty much all parts of the networks. So, it buys DSOs and TSOs option value. So just moving on to, exactly how we can deal with those constraints. Everything, kind of the assets that are able to alleviate constraints must be downstream of where the constraint lies on the network. When there are constraints that are at high voltage levels on the network, obviously the pool of assets that can be used to alleviate them is much larger. But when we get lower down to the voltage levels, so on the medium and low voltage levels, that pool becomes greatly reduced. And I think this is important to recognize when still probably the kind of rollout and adoption of distributed energy resources and consumer-owned energy resources is still fairly small. So that pool of assets that we can use to kind of alleviate issues still remains fairly small when we get lower down the network. So I think we've already touched on quite a lot of these today, but just to set the scene for the last session, really, just wanted to pull out kind of a range of different approaches that are available to alleviate constraints on the network. And I've tried to kind of split this out by kind of increasingly market-led solutions with price signals on that very top left, through to kind of more interventionist solutions. So direct device control, which I think we've already heard some thoughts on right at the beginning of the session. Across all of these, I think there are some really important questions to be answered, particularly thinking about kind of how close to real time that flexibility is procured. So in GB, we've seen that flexibility tenders are often looking to procure services way ahead of time, but increasingly, I think we're going to see constraints become more varied and become a lot harder to predict. So there may be an increasing need to move to either procuring services closer to real time or introducing more dynamic price signals that reflect kind of what's happening on the system and the network very close to real time. Similarly, that could be done in terms of allocating capacity as well. I think mostly that is done in a fairly kind of static way, but I think we've already heard that in Australia, one part that they're looking at is kind of dynamic allocation of capacity. Importantly, I don't think any of these solutions on their own will be sufficient. So it's really a combination of these approaches, and I think there are quite different approaches that suit kind of very different system needs. Yeah, oh, there we go. Big debate, big question is around whether implicit or explicit flex is the right approach. Already kind of laid out, I think, quite clearly which of those four options fall into the implicit versus explicit category. But I think it's just worthwhile kind of pulling out, neither of those on their own. They both have, positives and negatives. So with the price signal approach, potentially that could be more robust in the long term when constraints become less predictable. It requires kind of less infrastructure once up and running. And one, I think, real positive is that it moves away from that kind of baselining approach, which I'll come on to, that's definitely needed for the explicit approach to procurement. Important across all of these, but particularly with price signals, is the question of fairness and ensuring that kind of those consumers that adopt low carbon technologies aren't also the ones that we're paying to relieve the issues. So looking at kind of where those costs fall. In terms of explicit flexibility, I think this has some real positives for DSOs in terms of kind of giving bankability and assurance that a service will be provided when it's needed. But kind of auction process in general can be quite bureaucratic and kind of open to lobbying. And just wanted to then quickly highlight that, amongst the different kind of countries, there are quite different approaches that are already being taken to manage constraints. And I think from some of the discussions we've had, it's become very obvious that the market designs are very different already, as well as the governance arrangements and how network companies are regulated. And I think those differences alone will dictate what options may make sense in different countries. With network tariffs, we're seeing already quite a divergence in that some countries are opting to use kind of capacity-based charges, and others are moving to more time-of-use-based approach. Across France, Germany, and the UK, flexible connections are already being offered to alleviate or to allow new projects to connect to the grid quickly. And finally, I think there's quite a range in terms of the approach for kind of market procurement, with some countries very much in the trial phase, whereas others are already in kind of commercial rollout. So, huge differences already in terms of the tools that are being used. And I think with that, just wanted to pull out kind of the innovation that we've seen in terms of platform development and platforms that have come out to procure those services. So I appreciate there's a lot on there that you probably won't be able to read. But it's interesting just to point out kind of some of the differences here are around the scale. So whether these platforms are purely procuring kind of local services, or whether there's already coordination embedded within them. Equally, the ownership of the platforms changes, and we've seen in some cases these are fully owned by the TSOs or DSOs, and in others, third parties have come in to kind of sit between the service providers and the network operators. Oh. So I just quickly wanted to jump in on two examples. In GB, we've taken this kind of market-based flex tender approach, which I think some of the other speakers will go into more detail on, whereby DSOs are looking at the amount of flexibility that's needed, going to tender, and service providers are entering into contracts directly with the DSOs. And we've seen over time that the volume of contracts has increased, and the number of DSOs that are tendering for services has increased too. So I think this has been a really positive success story, but that's not to say, what we're doing now is definitely going to be the right solution in 10, 15 years' time. A slightly different approach that I thought it was interesting just to quickly reflect on is an approach that's being used in the Netherlands. So this is the development of a platform called GoPax, which is kind of a single interface for DSOs and TSOs to issue congestion notices. Once a congestion notice has been issued, service providers within the congested area submit kind of a buy or sell order, and service providers outside of the congested area issue the opposite, so a sell or a buy order, to essentially ensure that there's a balance in terms of kind of that coordination being integrated into the platform itself. So I think that's very interesting and quite different to what GB has taken in terms of its approach. And I think something that in GB is kind of only really now being talked about. So we've obviously already talked about some of the key kind of blockers and trade-offs that need to be thought about, but two that I will just focus on, particularly with the explicit approach. One issue is around kind of baselining and the need to baseline to measure that counterfactual of what would have happened. Whilst kind of with a large population size, that the output is quite accurate. As we get to a smaller sample sizes, the margin of error can increase significantly, which is obviously a problem when we're looking at much kind of more local parts of the grid. On the other hand, with the implicit approach, and we actually had an interesting conversation in my group about this, as we have more smart devices that are potentially responding to the same price signals, so responding to wholesale prices, for example, that can cause issues for network operators. If a lot of devices are responding to the same price signal, we have issues there with herding, and that can cause secondary peaks, which essentially results in kind of a whack-a-mole problem that the network operators have to deal with. So I will leave it there. I guess the final thing that just wanted to say is Of course, some barriers still remain, but I think regardless of which option is selected to kind of deal with constraints, or which combination of options, I think some of the key common enablers that we've already talked about is that we need to improve kind of visibility and monitoring on the networks, greatly improve simplicity to enable wider participation. Governance arrangements need work, and we need to clarify the roles of TSOs and DSOs. And finally, kind of increasingly, the more that we can automate what's happening and take that complexity away from consumers, the greater the volume of assets that can be used to help DSOs deal with network issues. Great.
Thank you, Maddie. And that was a really, round of applause for Maddie. And a sort of an interesting tour across Europe, and also interesting that there isn't a single solution for flex markets or flexibility, and that right now I think what's happening is where different operators are trialling different approaches, and we need to work with each other to work out what works best and what facets of a particular solution work best, and then spread that more widely. So in that vein, the next speakers are all going to talk about how they have been using flexibility or the work that they have done and what their vision for the future is.